Hello everyone, welcome to the build out video of my 2023 Tacoma TRD Off-road double cab long bed. Let's start off with an overview. I used extruded aluminum as the main structure of the L-shaped bench system for the bed, which will double as a backup sleepy spot and provide storage. I used 1-inch insulation and 1/2-inch plywood for the subfloor, and that same 1/2-inch plywood for the bench faces with some pole wrap on the outside. 3/4-inch plywood with a pre-finished top for the bench tops, and vinyl plank flooring for a more finished look. I also purchased a Super Pacific X1 camper to sit on top of the truck's bed rails. And all that being said, let's jump in. First things first, the actual bench portion of this build, gotta lay it out on the concrete to start the assembly. That's what I'm doing here. I checked I had all the right pieces of lengths I specified. You'll see I'm laying out the bottom plane first, which accounts for wrapping around the wheel well on the driver's side of the bed. Now I'm roughing in all of the gusseted angle brackets for each structural point, where one pieces of extruda baloo connects to another. This is probably a little over-engineered, but it is solid. After I placed all of the gusseted angle brackets, I moved on to placing all of my L brackets that I would use to mount the bench faces and attach the entire bench structure to the subfloor. I really didn't have any scientific reasoning for how many brackets I needed for the faces or the subfloor. I just based the number I thought I needed on a feeling after looking at it. And just to try to speed up the assembly process, I pre-fastened all of my gusseted angle brackets to the T-nuts with screws. I felt like this would have saved me time since the screws I ordered were a little on the short side, and it was a major pain to try to line up the screw in the bracket with the T-nut when it was placed in the extrudy patootie first. Something I'd definitely change if I were to do this again is to get longer screws. I thought it would have been easiest to assemble each plane, top and bottom, separately first and then add all my vertical lengths of aluminum, but in reality I realized how impossible that would have been. So basically I assembled the bottom plane, then built up by attaching the vertical lengths, and finally the top plane. Yeah, then I tried moving the plywood and other materials my dad and I had picked up at the hardware store out of their trailer. The inch-thick sheet of insulation was a piece of cake. Felt really good about myself after moving that one, but the 3-inch plywood I got for the bench tops was way too heavy and unwieldy for me, so I waited for some help. And as we were moving materials out of the trailer, my stepmom came home and played Tesla pranks on us. Then, once we had all of our materials organized, I learned how to use a circular saw. A very exciting moment. Power tools are wild, y'all. Here we measured and I started making cuts for the 1/2-inch plywood that I will glue to the 1-inch thick insulation layer for my subfloor. PPE and safety checks are important. I tried to cut as straight as possible, but didn't quite line up both sides perfectly. I later fixed this from happening again by picking up a big ol' Craig straight edge, which will make an appearance in a bit. And of course, had to do a few test fits to make sure my measurements were geometrically sound. Then my dad taught me how to use a jigsaw for cutting the shape around the wheel well. And right as we were coming in from our last test fit of the night, tragedy struck. I broke my mic cable and dented the CPL filter I keep on my lens. Both things are easily replaceable, blessed be. After that emotional roller coaster, we had food delivered and we took a break for the rest of the night. The next day, I set out to build the subfloor, aka attach plywood to an insulation layer. This first method I used was to use Gorilla Glue spray adhesive. You guys, I must have done something wrong here because small scale, this stuff, totally fine. But on a large 4x6 foot scale, it did not work. I noticed the spray adhesive started to eat away at the insulation layer, so fair warning there if you plan to do something similar. So I sprayed and sprayed and sprayed my little heart out until my finger started to shake, then attached both materials together and put a bunch of heavy shit on it. My dad later pointed out that I should have put the plywood on top, insulation on the bottom, so the weight of the plywood would help both pieces affix to each other. But live and learn. We moving on. Set the vibes right, doing a little more prepping of the bench faces. Then you'll never believe what happened as the vibes were flowing. The neighborhood kitty foreman came to check in on my progress. Such a sweet floof. Okay, back to it. More cutting bench faces, and while I was making my cuts this time, I had the brilliant idea of cleaning as I went. Because a clean shop is a happy shop, and a happy shop attracts cute AF kitties. And on the next day, I had to redo assembling the subfloor, and I wised up. Instead of using spray adhesive, I used liquid nails. I spent a lot of time thinking through exactly how this was all gonna go down. Reread the instructions like 14 times, and finally worked up the gumption to get after it. Now, this was my first time using liquid nails and a caulking gun for that matter. I need to hit the climbing gym and build those forearm muscles because owie wowie. Next up, back prepping the bench faces. Now, when I was coming up with concepts for what I wanted the interior to look like, I knew I wanted the vertical fluted furniture look to make the benches feel taller and make the space look more modern and bright. I found this stuff called pole wrap, which is essentially strips of MDF attached to this flexible canvasy type material used to make structural poles and basements look a little more dressed up. This stuff saved me so much time because I didn't have to glue each individual wood flute to the plywood I used for the bench faces. All I had to do was cut the pole wrap to size and liquid nail it up. Honestly, liquid nails was probably overkill for this because the bench faces aren't structural in any way. I just decided to use that because I had it left over from attaching the 1/2-inch plywood to the 1-inch purple insulation layer. Now, initially I tried to just score this stuff with a box cutter, but that didn't quite work for me, so I learned to use my third saw of the build, the miter saw. And that was all for the first week. 3 weeks later, I drove to Portland for install day. The folks at Super Pacific are great, super friendly, and installation took about an hour and a half, including a tour of their shop and a rundown of all the little ins and outs of my new camper. I said RIP to my gas mileage and promptly implemented the miles per gallon mentality. After install, it was back to my parents' house to get things finalized, starting off with the bench tops, which consisted of a test fit, a lot of micro adjustments, and measuring twice, thrice, thrice? Okay, so this big old Craig straight edge thingamajig is amazing, I'll tell ya. Basically, a huge saw ruler that you can more easily trust to help you make a straight cut. Then it was off to the races. We cut down the sturdy piece of 3/4-inch ply to the right width for the bench faces, and were able to successfully grain match the pieces once they were all cut to length. I also wised up yet again and got us some face PPE so we weren't breathing in sawdust while working. Then I cut the skinnier bench tops to the right size and had a slight miscalculation. Didn't compensate enough for the overhang over the bench faces the first time, but luckily we had enough of the sheet of 3/4-inch ply left over. After that, we tried a couple different ways to make a template for this funky cutout in the back of the bed. Ultimately, I first taped a few smaller pieces of cardboard to the rough shape, scribed that on a larger single piece of cardboard, then scribed that onto my wood and cut that shape out with a jigsaw. Whew! Admittedly, this took me way longer than I thought it would because I wanted to make sure I got it right. We had already done our grain matching and it would have been so painful to mess this part up at the very end and need to redo part of the top that then didn't match. Now, we're nearing the final steps here. I went through and attached the extrudabalubadoo bench to the subfloor with some wood screws. This was a lot of anchor points. This thing is not going anywhere. Now, what I didn't record in the moment was creating alignment blocks for all of the separate benchtop pieces. I had originally wanted some hidden cabinet hinges, but didn't have enough time this go around to plan that out. I had decided to compromise and do piano hinges on the top, but ultimately my dad came up with a great idea to just use alignment blocks and treat the tops as fully removable lids instead of hinged lids. Genius and time cost effective. Next, I finished the bench faces. I I picked up some spray paint and applied a couple coats, but it could use a few more. I think this MDF is really absorbent because it turned out a little splotchy in areas, and since I was using spray paint, I had a hard time getting it to evenly sit in the grooves of the pull wrap. Okay. And we're on to the last touches. Here are a few pics of the final cuts to the floating vinyl plank flooring I installed, which I also didn't record because time crunch. And that wraps up phase 1. Let me know if you have any questions about the build. I'll answer them as best I can in the comments below, and I'll be putting together a little walk-around tour as well now that I've spent a few nights in it and have all my camping gear settled. Otherwise, until next time, I'll see you on the trails.
All right.
That looks freaking cool.
It does. Look, your dream came together.
Wow. Nice.